Hello again to everybody, and hi to Jan in the chat room, which I can see now in the background. So in the next 55 minutes to an hour, we're going to talk about how to craft the perfect story. And we're going to talk about story elements and how to create a great narrative for a podcast or actually for any creative endeavor. And I'm going to throw in some advice on editing, podcast editing, and how editing can really enhance the effectiveness of your show. So I'm basing my my tips and information on the fact that I actually started my career in podcasting through being an author. I come from the world of the written word, basically. I authored 3 books on science and technology. And actually, the podcast episode of my life is kind of grew out of being an author. So I first of all learned how to craft a story, and only then did I start actually creating audio content, which I think was very helpful when I look back at it. So the first question that should be answered is why a story at all? And there are many sorts and types of podcasts that seem irrelevant to the idea of a story. For example, you might have an interview-based podcast, or maybe a news type of podcast. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I can't use any elements of building a story within those types of podcasts. Well, I think you do. Having a story doesn't mean that there has to be the classic sort of a story as the one you'll find in a movie or book. It's just a matter of having the right elements that we shall discuss in a moment in your creation, in your podcast, so that it makes the topic that you are talking about more interesting, more communicative, helps the listener remember what was being said. For example, if you're talking about a news story of sort, some sort of topic that is in the news currently, you can craft that news item in a way that will have a more impact as sort of a story, instead of just giving away the facts as if you're having a list of items that you want to read off a page. It's just a matter of having the right mindset, I would say. And when you're a creator, both in podcasting, but also in writing and video producing, whatever, thinking about the story first will give you a real advantage in terms of having the listener's attention and having them enjoy the content. Even when making an interview, you can edit the interview later, unless it's live to tape. I mean, if you just setting it live on the internet, so you can't edit it. But if you do edit an interview, you can edit the content so that it creates a better story without damaging the information content of the interview itself. So let's talk about the elements of a good story. Okay, I mean, everything that they're going to say here is, of course, not a new and original idea that I just kind of cooked up from my mind. The elements of a good story are kind of they are old concepts. Goes back to the ancient Greeks and their theaters, and of course, writing as a profession has been around for a very long time. So we have a basic idea of what constitutes a great story and what attracts people. So the first thing that you have to remember, that a good story needs to have a hero, with air quotes, okay? I should call it a protagonist, maybe. A hero doesn't have to be some sort of a heroic figure, Superman-like a heroic figure. It's just someone whose story revolves around, and someone who has as a way to maybe channel the story through his or her actions and confrontations later on. For example, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about and how a protagonist doesn't have to be good in the moral sense of the word, being a true hero. I did an episode on Curious Minds about U-boat technology in World War II, Nazi technology, submarine Nazi technology. And this is basically a technical subject. I mean, we're talking about, in the episode, about the technology of the submarines. Okay, so basically you might be thinking, well, I mean, where's the story in engines and torpedoes, etc.? So as the protagonist of that story, I chose Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was head of the Nazi fleet in World War II. Why did I choose specifically that character to be the hero of the episode, of the story? Not because Dönitz was a hero in the moral sense. He was a Nazi, an anti-Semitist, but his story is a powerful one. I mean, as an admiral, he rose from the ranks of the Navy as a young officer who actually was captured by the British at some point in World War I. He rose to be the admiral of the small German Navy. It was a rather weak navy when the Second World War began, and helped build it to be the true menacing enemy of the Allies that we know it was at the end of the war. So Dönitz's personal story allowed me to actually have some sort of a narrative on which I can actually drive the story and tell various aspects of U-boat technology through his ideas, his actions, his thoughts on the matter. Okay, so the first thing that we should think about is who's the hero of the story? Who is the one who drives the story forwards, whose actions and ideas and struggle is going to make things interesting? The second element is a true powerful need for that hero, that protagonist. What do I mean? You can have a protagonist who is maybe the center of attention, but if that protagonist doesn't want anything specific, or if what he wants is trivial and not interesting in a sense, that story is going to be very weak. It's not going to be as powerful. So in the case of, for example, I did an episode on the Black Death plague that hit Europe in the Middle Ages. A very powerful historic story by itself. As a hero of that specific episode, I chose a figure of a doctor called Alexander Yersin, who was the first to discover the actual way that the plague was transmitted between people, which was through rats carrying a sort of a bug that bit people and then transmitted the disease. So when I crafted the story, I tried to think about it from that Dr. Yersin's point of view. What does he want? He wants to eradicate a disease. And it's not just a disease, it's the Black Death, it's the plague. It's a disease that has killed hundreds of millions of humans throughout history. So that makes his personal struggle a very powerful one. It's not a trivial need. Okay, so when you're talking, maybe when you're having an interview with someone and you're trying to tell that person's story, okay, think about it first. I mean, he's your hero. I mean, since he's being interviewed, he is the hero of the episode. And you have probably written your questions beforehand and did your research beforehand. So try to think, what was his need? Why did he do the things that he do? If it was an entrepreneur, for example, did he think did he know of a problem that needed to be solved? And if you think of that problem and you describe it before actually talking about what was that entrepreneur's solution, you're making your protagonist's story much more powerful. Just thinking about that angle first. So moving on, and I have my notes here, of course, since I'll never remember everything by heart. Every story needs a bad guy. Okay, and again, don't think of the bad guy in the moral sense of the story that we know, the kind of Hollywood movie, for example. It just needs to be a strong opposition to the protagonist, or someone who is trying to maybe disrupt what the protagonist is trying to do, or create some sort of an opposition. And again, that bad guy that we're talking about doesn't have to be first bad in a moral sense, and it doesn't have to be human even. It just could be a result of something that is happening in the world, and it's trying to disrupt the protagonist's way, trying to reach his goals, achieve his need, solve his need. For example, I gave before the example of the plague, the Black Death. Okay, so who's the bad guy here? There's no actually a human which is trying to prevent Yersin from finding a cure or identifying the disease's vector. It's the plague itself. It's the rats. It's the bug. It's the whole story behind trying to beat or trying to eliminate deadly disease. And once you have that disease, and I built the story, first of all, describing the disease itself. First of all, before I even mentioned Yersin in the episode, I first of all discussed the disease, how terrible it was, how many people it killed. And of course, I gave descriptions of people dying during the Black Death in the Middle Ages. And through those 10, 15 minutes in the beginning, even before speaking about Yersin and his attempts to eliminate the disease, we built up a powerful villain of sort, some sort of a terrifying enemy, for example. If we give an example of U-boat technology in the Second World War that I previously discussed also, the nemesis of Karl Dunitz were the Allies. And they were the good guys, okay? They are not bad in the moral sense. But by discussing the Allies' ships and sonar technology and all the equipment that they had to actually try and hunt down the U-boats during the World War II, you actually make the opposition to Karl Dunitz much more powerful. You're trying to make the story much more powerful by giving the enemy of the protagonist a real power, a real opponent. And a classic example in movies, of course, is Darth Vader in Star Wars. The first thing that we know about Darth Vader is that he is capable of eliminating stars. He's all powerful. He can choke you with his mind. As powerful, as much as the bad guy is powerful as the opposition, that determines how good the story is going to be. Because if the opposition is weak in the story, your hero is not going to have that much effect, that much drive on the story. So you're going to have to think, first of all, about your protagonist, about his needs, and find an opponent of sorts, if there is one, to make the story rounder and better. And having said that, remember that we're talking about elements of the story. Okay, not every story has all the perfect elements. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have an item or a story of sorts, or an historical story that doesn't have a clear opponent or clear hero. But you can still try and take particular elements that we're discussing here and fit them inside your story. And it will make it, if not as powerful as it can be, still very powerful. So the next element we're going to discuss is what I call the action of the story, okay? And again, it doesn't have to be action in the Hollywood sense of the word that, I mean, the protagonist is blowing up buildings and shooting the bad guys. It's just a matter of thinking about what the protagonist is doing, what he's hoping to achieve, and then kind of disrupting that progression, hopefully in a surprising way. I mean, if in the story the hero wants to get to a certain point or have some sort of a success and he gets there, that's not a good story. I mean, that's kind of trivial. There has to be something that the protagonist is trying to do, and then he fails for some reason. Maybe the bad guy did something unexpected. Maybe someone intervened or something in a setting changed. That kind of breaks the expectation of the protagonist and makes it much more powerful for the story. For example, in Carl Dunitz's story as part of the Second World War, U-boat technology that I spoke before, was as part of trying to establish what was called the wolf pack strategy, having many German subs collaborate and attack on ships in the Atlantic, for example. And that was a winning strategy for him. When he started doing that, implementing that strategy, it was a huge success, and the Allies suffered greatly. But you're kind of thinking the story, so he wants to win in the war, he has to win in the war, and he's winning. He's doing something smart. The hero expects to be successful. And then in the story, the British capture an Enigma machine, which was sort of a crypto technologies kind of communication device, which actually allowed the British to hack into the German communication channels and kind of know in advance where the wolf packs are going to be. And when that happens, of course, the German Navy kind of the casualties climb up. So that's an action bit in the story, which is very powerful in terms of dramatic effect, since we have the breaking of an expectation of the protagonist trying to reach his target. Maybe another example for that kind of story element is another episode I did about Richard Stallman and the history of open source technology. Again, it's a very technical story. I mean, open source technology and software, what can be more technical oriented? But I had a protagonist. His name was Richard Stallman, who was the father of open source. And he's a programmer, a famous programmer who left his job software foundation that promoted the idea of free software, free not as in without money, but free in the sense that the source code is available to everyone. That was in the early 80s, if you remember. And in the story, and in the historical narrative as well, in the story, I describe Stallman's attempts to win over the hearts of the public and try to convince the public that open source was not called open source, it was free software is important, and he succeeds. And we describe how he builds a movement, the free software movement, and everybody is happy, and the movement is growing. And then there's a split in the movement, and it splits to free software movement and open source movement, two separate movements with two separate agendas. And that's a powerful element in the story, since it kind of disrupts what was rejected way, stands in the way. So these are examples. And another element, another thing that you have to remember about actions when you're talking about actions is that talking is a sense of storing. If you describe something, if you describe an item, an event, or talking within an interview about something, try not to talk about things, but describe actions. I did that and that and that, or the protagonist did so and so. Not he said that so and so and so, because usually in a story there is much more impact to actions than to words. You can say whatever you want. You can be as talkative and say wise and smart words, but if you do something that is completely different than what you talked about, then it's not that powerful, right? I mean, imagine Luke Skywalker just talking about maybe toppling bad empire, and then just leaving the fight and going to be a farmer on Tatooine or whenever it was, okay? Just joining the battle by itself, the action is what makes things powerful. It's always the function. So moving on to the final element of the story is the ending, okay? An ending has to be powerful. And actually, you might even say that the ending is maybe the most important element in the story, in the sense that you can have a fantastic story all throughout the episode, talking about things that were happening and having twists and stuff, and a good protagonist and a good opponent, whatever. And then if you have a weak ending and nothing happened really, it was just kind of a fizzling out of the story, there's not that sort of an emotional catharsis. It's called a catharsis in the academic circles, okay? The emotional buildup of the story does not reach a kind of a powerful end to it. There's no release of that pent-up energy that you built during the whole story. So at the beginning, when you're already thinking about what you're going to do in the episode, how you're going to build the episode, start from the end. Start from thinking, okay, what's going to be the end of the story? Why is it powerful? For example, does it tell us something new that we didn't think about? Does it bring something interesting or some surprising in a sense? For example, we talked about Carl Dunitz's war, U-boat technology, etc. And in the story, the real historical narrative, the German fleet launched a revolutionary type of U-boat called Mark or 21 or Type 21. And that was a revolutionary submarine, and it was faster and quieter and more than anything that the Allied navies had. The only problem was that it was launched actually at the final month of the war. If it was launched a few months earlier, it could have maybe changed the way World War II was heading. But it just was launched too late. So at the very end of the episode, I describe an encounter of that first Type 21 submarine with a British destroyer. And I describe how the captain of the submarine lurks behind the destroyer, slowly catches up to it, and has it on its sights. It's based on historical narrative that I found in my research. And he has his sights on the British destroyer, and the audience can also almost feel how Dunitz's goal is almost at hand. He has that amazing submarine now that can destroy British and American boats easily. They can't do anything about it. And he has his finger literally on the fire torpedo button. And then you describe to the audience how he's actually holding in his hand the message to surrender, that the German army, the Nazi army, has surrendered to the Allies, and he doesn't open fire. But that particular ending gives the audience a sense of how close the German Navy was to actually winning the Battle of the Atlantic. And if you describe it in a good way, it can make such a powerful ending to the story, because then the audience realizes how close they were. JD Sutter at the chat room says there has to be a payoff. And that's completely right. And it actually, it kind of works with what I was saying about having a worthwhile goal for the protagonist, having a need, having something that worth fighting for. That might be also called some sort of a payoff. I mean, in Star Wars, the need to destroy the evil empire, the payoff that is that, okay, you're going to free the entire galaxy of tyranny. Okay, that kind of speaks together with that need. So just to recap what we were discussing about the elements of a good story. Okay, we talked about why we need a good story, that a good story is the cornerstone of every kind of media. If it is a journalistic item, an interview, a movie, a written story, or a podcast episode of any sort, of any type, if you have a good story as the basis of your item, you're going to have more success. You're going to have the attention of the audience in a more focused way, and the audience is going to remember. And keep in mind that as humans, our minds are very adapted to stories, because, I mean, as you probably know, back in ancient times, in prehistory time, when there wasn't any written communication, the only way to transmit information reliably of sorts is through stories. People were sitting around campfires and telling stories. And actually what we do know from times before writing are stories, such as the Odyssey, for example, which is a very ancient story, well before the ancient Greek had written words, for example. So that's a very powerful thing to have, a story. And the elements of a good story have been explored by authors and creators throughout the ages. And we know that a good protagonist, a good hero, can make a good story. And that protagonist has to have a great need. The stronger the need, the stronger the story. And there has to be opposition. There has to be the proverbial bad guy trying to disrupt what the protagonist is doing. And as powerful as the bad guy is going to be, the story is going to be powerful as well. And the story progresses through a series of actions by the protagonist. And those actions should be, I didn't mention that, now that I'm recapping, it's a good time to mention that those actions should be active in the sense of that the hero is initiating those actions. It's not working passively on. It's not happening to the protagonist just because he's standing there and something happens. If it's something that he initializes and drives, it's going to be a better kind of action. And that action has to be disrupted in sorts by the bad guy or by the setting or whatever happens in the world. And that conflict between what the protagonist wants and what actually happens in the story is what drives the drama of the story. Okay, you can have many twists and turns in the story. And finally, a great ending. A great ending is very powerful. If you have a weak ending and it's kind of fizzle out in the end, then the story is not going to be powerful. Okay, You have to think about how can I make the ending be very powerful? How can I make it something that the audience remembers? And how do I drain that emotional pent up energy that I did? So now that we discussed the elements of a perfect story, let's discuss a bit about editing. And why am I talking about? Well, I mean, what do I mean when I'm saying editing, and what does it have to do with a story? Okay, so in podcasting, you can think about maybe two general types of shows. There are the shows which are non-edited. That is, it's live to tape. You record something and you transmit it as it was. And actually, from my experience, about 80% of podcasts are like that. If there is any editing at all, it's very minimal. And then there's the 20% of podcasts who do edit their shows. And when I'm talking about editing, I mean, I usually talk about two kind of actions on the raw recording. One is removing unnecessary or bad parts of the raw audio. We will discuss in a bit what constitutes a bad part of raw audio. Just cutting away stuff that you don't need, for example. And the other aspect of editing is actually modifying the raw audio in a sense that you add to it in a way. That adding can be maybe reordering the way the audio was recorded to make a better story. Or you can talk about, you can maybe add music or sound effects to the raw recording to make a better atmosphere. We'll discuss in a bit. Or you can add whatever you like. I mean, just adding voices and stuff to the actual raw audio. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about editing your podcast. And when you kind of zoom out on the podcast community of podcasts, on the whole podcast that we see around us, all the podcasts that we see around us, I think that we can generally summarize that most of the time, the podcasts who are gonna be more successful are the ones who were edited. And I mean, it's obvious that I'm generalizing, okay? There are many podcasts which are not edited at all, or maybe just minimally edited, if at all, and they are still very successful. But looking at who are the biggest and most successful podcasts in the podsphere in general, you can see that This American Life and Radio Lab and Serial and NPR in general has a very heavy editorial focus on almost all of its shows. And also the BBC does many edited podcasts. And many of the more narrative podcasts, I mean, though the dramatic podcasts tell a story, The Message, for example, was a successful podcast about a year ago. Generally speaking, editing makes your podcast more likely to be successful. And we'll discuss a bit why. But I'm not a scientist. So what I'm saying is not maybe backed up by statistics and numbers. That's for someone else to research in the future. How important is editing? But as an author and as an avid podcast listener for the last 10 years, right from the beginning of podcasts, I generally have the sense that edited shows are going to be more successful, even if the audience doesn't necessarily notice that they are being edited. For example, there are those who edit their interviews and remove bad parts of the interviews, and you are not even aware that some parts of the interview were just removed, were cut away, and you think that it was live to tape, but you don't really know what happened behind the scenes. So we talked about what is editing, and now let's talk about why it's so important, I think. Allow me to have a look at my notes. So the first aspect of editing, as I said, is improving the technical audio quality of your show. That has zero effect. I mean, that has nothing to do with storytelling that I was mentioned that I talked before. That's just that the technical quality of your show. And it's still very important. I used to review a lot of podcasts as part of the podcasting community on Reddit. I did a service basically for the community members, and I would listen to an episode or two episodes of a show, and I would mail the hosts, an analysis of their show. It was a fun thing for me to do. And first of all, many of the podcasts were unedited. I mean, amateurish in a way, unedited completely. But what was almost apparently from the get-go is that people were not taking care of the technical quality of the audio. And when I'm talking about audio quality, I'm talking about noises in the background, a passing car, somebody's phone ringing in the background, for example. Things that you can sometimes remove easily with a simple edit. Just cut away that sound, a disturbing sound, or maybe leveling the voices of various hosts. And you have one host whose volume is high and another two hosts, a host or another host whose volume is low. So those kinds of technical problems can be solved rather easily by very basic editing software such as Audacity, and it can improve your technical quality of the show greatly. And you might be asking yourself, okay, so why bother? I mean, is it that important to edit the technical, have a great technical? People might be thinking to themselves, well, I'm not NPR. I don't have a studio. People know that it is recorded in my basement, right? Or whatever. The answer is no. The answer is that people are, when they're listening, especially for the first time that they are listening to your show, within the first 10 seconds of hearing the sound of the podcast, they get a sort of a first impression of your show. And as we know, in every aspect of our lives, first impressions count greatly. The impression that you did in the first 10 seconds of the episode, you're going to have to fight it for the next hour. If the audio quality was bad in the first 10 seconds, you can have a that whole episode, but you're against the preconceived notion that the listener have that you're an amateur. Think about maybe imagine an episode of Serial, okay, maybe the most successful podcast in history. And imagine the narrator starting to talk, and you can kind of hear with echoes around, and it was recorded somewhere with shitty equipment, for example. You're not going to have the same passion and the same kind of good inquiry, good curiosity about the episode when you hear that kind of sound, because you might be thinking, okay, they are amateurs. The product is not going to be good. It's the same with clothing, and the same with almost every aspect of your life. So improving the technical aspect will first of all give you a fair chance to compete against great other podcasts. Why? Because the great thing about audio in general, radio in general, is that people don't know where you're recording from necessarily. You can have a chance to fake it, to sound as if your quality is professional and you're recording from a very great location or studio, and people won't know until maybe much later, and then they won't even care because the content was great. Just an anecdote. I sometimes do in my shows bits where I pretend that I'm outside the studio, maybe being on location somewhere at the museum or sailing on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for example. These are just effects on the background, right? I just alter the sound a bit, add some water effects and the noises in the background. The audience doesn't know. I'm getting mails from listeners saying, "Wow, did you really visit? Were you really sailing in the middle of the Atlantic for the show?" And I have to say, no, of course I didn't. But first impressions count, and you also have to take to think about what is called ear fatigue. Ear fatigue is a really physical phenomenon. It's a mental phenomenon. If your podcast has low quality audio, you're gonna tire the audience. It's very hard to focus on an audio which is very low, very weak audio, or maybe if many hosts talk simultaneously during an episode, it takes a lot of mental energy from the listener to think about who is talking now, and it kind of drains the stamina of the listener. So these kinds of things can be fixed with the editing, good editing. That's the first thing, and that doesn't have anything to do with the story. But then we get to the other aspect of editing, which is adding stuff to the raw audio, which has a great impact on storytelling. I usually edit my shows heavily, and what I'm doing is trying, first of all, to add great music, background music. I'm not talking about putting just inserting a random song in the middle of a story just to have some sort of a music interlude. But when I'm talking about things which are dramatic in a sense, and there's a dramatic bit of in the story, I add a soft background of dramatic music. Music is very emotional. It has an emotional effect. So having a dramatic music in the background, which is very easy to add, can have a great impact on the dramatic effect of your story, for example. Or if there is a sad part in the story, add some sad piece of music in the background. It's very easy to do. I mean, there are many sources of pod-safe music that we can utilize today, and adding music with tools like Audacity, for example, is very easy. Just make sure that you're not having the music too strong to actually interfere with the listening experience of the narrator, of the interview, for example. And of course, you have to be mindful not to get too cheesy with sound effects and background music, right? I mean, you don't have you don't want to make the story kind of be too sticky, like fluffy cheese kind of a cheesy effect, right? Be mindful not to go over the edge, okay? But having music, for example, is very important. And yes, less is more, as J.D. Sutter says, for example. Fluffy cheese. Yeah, I just invented that. Maybe it's something in Hebrew that can't be translated to English very well. So adding music, adding a bit of sound effects sometimes can be also important if you're doing it correctly. I don't recommend using sound effects. I mean, like, horns or cars moving in the background or whatever, because if you it's very easy to overdo things and get too cheesy and get not be serious enough. But sometimes adding a sort of a subtle sound effect in the background can be helpful. But what is really helpful most of the time is adding more voices to the story. For example, having an archival part that you can find from maybe an old movie in YouTube as part of a kind of something that talks with or communicates with the rest of the story. Maybe there's something that the interviewee said or something that you discussed, and suddenly there's a new voice in the podcast, something that grabs the attention of the listener. And if you do that correctly and you choose the voices that you insert in the episode correctly, then it makes the story much more powerful. And that's actually a strong element of building a story, editing. And it's no wonder that This American Life, Serial, Radio Lab, they all edit the shows heavily and add a lot of stuff and makes the listening experience fantastic. Um, Editing in the technical sense is something that most podcasters don't like to do, since it's not the fun part of producing a podcast. The fun part is sitting around talking with your pals in the panel, or interviewing someone and listening to his story. Doing editing, post processing, is usually considered to be boring. But again, it's a very important aspect of your podcast success. So I would really recommend a podcaster to, first of all, download Audacity, a fantastic open source free software, very easy to learn. There are many, many YouTube tutorials that explain the basic of Audacity. Within half an hour, you can be up and going. You're just doing the basic fixes that you need, and trying and learning Audacity, for example, and trying and learning how to edit is a very worthwhile investment in the success of your podcast. Try to listen to podcasts who do edit their shows and add stuff. For example, when I listen to Radio Lab, NPR's WNYC's Radio Lab, for example, I usually listen twice to an episode. Once to enjoy the podcast as a story, just as a listener, and once again, as a professional, trying to figure out what was going on there. What were the sounds, or what were the editing techniques that the producer, Jad Abumrad, he's sort of a genius in that field, what did he do that made the story so powerful? And I wouldn't say that I'm copying what he's doing, but I'm certainly trying to get inspiration, maybe, from what other people are doing. So to recap, the editing thing, that the editing part of what we're talking about, editing, I think, is important. I can't prove what I'm saying numerically, statistically, but I do have a sense as a listener that heavily edited podcasts, or edited in general podcasts, succeed much more than unedited podcasts. And certainly I felt that way when I reviewed podcasts for other podcasters and tried to assess how good they were doing. The unedited podcasts were always down in terms of how good they were. Always, whatever the content was. So editing is important, and we talked about two elements of editing. One is purely technical, removing background noises, removing maybe parts of the conversation. That's something that I didn't actually mention before. That's something new. Removing, if you have a conversation, a panel of sorts of a few hosts, or an interview, those kinds of interviews and panels tend to go on tangents. Okay, we discussed something, and then something interesting comes up, and we kind of drift in the conversation towards that interesting something, which doesn't really have anything to do with the original topic of the show, for example, or with the story that you're trying to tell, the story of the interviewee, for example. So in post-processing, just cutting, pruning that unnecessary content, that kind of redundant, tangent stuff, actually improves the story. Okay, that's an important part of editing. So we talked about the technical aspect, just removing background noises and leveling the volumes of all the hosts to prevent ear fatigue and to improve the chance of having a great, good first impression on the listener. And then we discussed the way you can enhance your podcast with additions such as sound effects, adding voices to the podcast. So I think that wraps up my time here. So first of all, thank you very much to all the listeners who joined in, and I really hope that I brought some valuable insights that you can really implement within your shows. Um, and I would, of course, recommend that you visit my website. Curious Minds is the podcast. The address is cmpod.net. And listen to many of the stories that I put there as examples here. For example, U-boat technology and open source technology and the history of the Black Death and such. And maybe try to see the way I implement my stories as examples. Good examples, maybe bad examples. You'll be the judge, of course. But I do try to bring my authoring career into podcasting. So with that, Dave, thank you very much for having me. And I'm signing off from Israel. Have had a great time the last